There is only love.
Do not be alarmed. We're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He was raised. He is not here. Look at the spot where they put him. But go and tell his disciples, including the rock, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, just as he said he would do. This is a passage from Mark that we'll explore in more detail. You know, in the modern era, we often celebrate the birth of significant people. Sometimes we even commemorate the day with legal holidays, which is a real holiday. So we had Dr. King in January, and in February we have Presidents Washington and Lincoln. And then if we scoot all the way to December, the end of the year, we honor the birth of the Jewish carpenter, the teacher, the sage, the guru, the person known as Jesus. And today we honor his death, or actually, is he really dead? In a real way, we are celebrating, as one local minister calls it, the original Walking Dead. Yeah. It's really a kind of a cute video if you want to go online and check it out. So today we honor the resurrection, or at least the possibility of the resurrection of the carpenter, philosopher, teacher, Jesus the Nazarene. And today we acknowledge and celebrate really one of the great teachers of consciousness, particularly in the Western world. And so from Scripture, from Mark 16, the entire passage from this part of the New Testament. And when the Sabbath day was over, Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they could go and embalm him. And very early on Sunday, they got to the tomb just as the sun was coming up. And they had been asking themselves, who will help us roll the stone away from the opening of the tomb? Then they looked up and discovered that the stone had been rolled away. For Mark tells us, for in fact, he makes a note of writing this down, for in fact the stone was very heavy, very large. And when they went into the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, wearing a white robe, and they grew apprehensive. Look, there's a live guy in this dead tomb. I'd imagine. So when he says to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He was raised. He is not here. Look at the spot where they put him. Go and tell his disciples, including Rock, which is Peter, that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he said you would. And once they got outside, they ran away from the tomb, because great fear and excitement got the better of them. And they didn't breathe a word of it to anyone. Talk about terrified. Now this is from the annotated scholar's version. This is one version of Mark. There are several versions. There are several translations of Mark, depending on which translation you use. But this ending is the one that most scholars agree is the original text from the author that we know today as Mark. And there are several other versions of this story that differ slightly, essentially the same story, but each one different, each one with a different perspective. So Matthew, who is a Jewish scribe, puts in connections and roots to the Jewish history from Isaiah, from Zechariah, from many prophets, Jeremiah who came before, to tie Jesus into the Jewish story of being the Messiah. Luke was a Greek physician and wrote in Greek, and not in the everyday vernacular, but in the proper Greek, whatever that sounds like. Right? I don't think it sounds like that. All right, and then John, really the mystical interpretation of what all of this meant. And none of these stories, by the way, recorded until the earliest they've determined is 35 years after the crucifixion. And, in fact, the founder, really the guy who's recognized as the founder of Christianity, Paul of Tarsus, his letters, or those things that we call the epistles, right? The letters of Paul are called the epistles, predated the first New Testament book, which was Mark, by the way, not Matthew, as many of us learn. So, and the other thing is that there's always been controversy. There's always been controversy at the very beginning of the Christian church. So was this message just for Jews? Now, and in fact, James and Peter said yes, only for Jews. Paul said no, Gentiles too. Right? When he said, "This is my body," was that really true? Or are we just doing the bread and wine thing in remembrance? What about the divinity of Jesus? Was he really divine? Was he born divine, or did he become divine? Right? We're still arguing these things. Right? That's why there's all these different denominations. Even within Catholicism. Right? There's like 6 Catholic, which means universal, by the way, 6 Catholic churches. Right? So controversial that it took 325 years. Constantine got everybody together, right? So from Rome all the way around Asia Minor, Antioch, to Jerusalem, to Alexandria, even to northern Africa, Tunisia, where Augustine and his buddies were, Origen, those guys. They all had differing opinions on what it was to be Christian. So he got them together, locked them in a room and said, "Okay, work it out. You're not coming out, and you can't go to the bathroom till it's all done." Which means, of course, that there were some winners. The winners, of course, are the texts that we read today, and the losers, which were called heretical. They were heresies and destroyed. In fact, they were so vehement about the destruction of these texts that they even destroyed the library in Alexandria in Egypt, that didn't just have philosophy in it, but all the sciences, everything from the ancient world destroyed in the name of the truth. Right? So they figured out what to read, what the right texts are, what the right books are, when to pray, how to pray, and on what holidays do we celebrate. Because holidays were a big thing. Remember, this is the pagan world. There were rituals in place for each of these pagan deities, and the Romans took their gods very seriously, even though they embraced and allowed all religious teachings, with the caveat that you had to also pay homage and sacrifice to the Roman gods as well. And this the Christians refused to do. And that was one of the reasons why they were persecuted. There were other reasons, but that was like the main one. Because the Romans took their God thing very seriously. So, a lot of different things were worked out. In fact, even Easter being a floating holiday tied to Passover. Right? But in fact, speaking to this pagan thing, the word Easter is a pagan word, has a pagan root. Ostre, right? Which is a German word, Northern European, right? So the Greco-Hebrew is Pascha. And in fact, in many Catholic and Christian traditions, particularly in Europe, this is what the holiday is called, in the Greek church, for instance. So, what has all this got to do with religious science anyway? Well, again, it's that idea of a continuation and unfolding of consciousness. And what does religious science teach about Jesus? What does religious science teach about the resurrection? Well, clearly Ernest Holmes was a big lover of Jesus. He loved Jesus. He believed in Jesus and believed in the teachings of Jesus as universal truths. And he believed in the resurrection, though he had his own unique take on it. So, oh, there's the Holy Sepulchre. Well, it was. And now we're going to move on to, yeah, there it is. So they called home makeover after the tomb. That was the best they could do. 2,000 years, you think they could bring some more light into it or something. Anyway, the tomb's in there in the very back. We have to lower your head and go into it. Anyway, so this is what Holmes had to say. That the physical disappearance of Jesus after the resurrection was a result of the spiritualization of his consciousness. The spiritualization of his consciousness. This so quickened his mentality that his body disintegrated and his followers could not see him because he was on another plane. And Holmes says that planes then are not places. They are states of consciousness. Now I know for some folks who come from a Latin version of the church, and other, I'm sure, other denominations as well, or flavors of a particular denomination, Easter's a big day. It's a time to honor those who have gone before, who have died and gone before. And so this idea that planes are not places, they are states of consciousness, speaks to our belief in the immortality of the soul. And that when we cast off this mortal coil, that we are still here, but we are simply on another plane. And so whoever has gone before us, whether recently, our ancestors even, they're all here with us on some plane. In fact, the physicists tell us there are 10 planes to existence, that we can only detect 4 of them. So isn't that interesting? Planes are not places, they are states of consciousness. You're not supposed to see that yet. So the question I always ask is, why is there so much time spent on the last 3 days of the ministry of Jesus? Why is there so much time spent on the need to pay this blood debt? Why is there so much time spent on those 3 days and the days that followed? So much emphasis on the resurrection. When we look at the entire body of work of the ministry of this person that we call Jesus, what we see is someone who is a lover of humanity, a lover of the destitute, the cast off, the alcoholic, the prostitute, the adulteress, the tax collector. Right? So a tax collector in that time was someone in the tribe, a Jew, who was going around collecting money for the occupying army, the Romans. You know, talk about the double whammy. How do I hate thee? Let me count the ways. These were Jesus' friends, and fishermen, guys who worked on the lowest rung of Jewish society. These were his friends. These were his apostles, the people who he spent the most time with. That he loved people so much and challenged the people of his day when they were going to stone the adulterers to say, "Let he among you who is without sin, without error, cast the first stone. Right? And then they threw their stones down in dejection and walked away. How come we don't focus on that more societally? And so to me, it begs the question, how would it be? How would it be to be in the presence of someone who loved you without wanting anything from you? How would it be to be in the presence of someone who wanted nothing from you? No acknowledgement needed, no expectation, no judgment, no I'd love you more if you just did this or that, no demands for reciprocation. How would it be to be in the presence of someone who loved you without anything, wanting anything from you? No expectation put on you to perform in any way. In fact, even if you let them down, their love would not be reduced one iota. So we have this story in this week about how Peter, his best friend, denied even knowing him 3 times. Right? And still that love was there. So I wonder, could we, or how would it be? How would it be to receive that kind of love? And it makes me ask myself the question, could we do it? Could we receive that kind of love? Can we be that vulnerable and courageous in our vulnerability to receive love in that way? So I imagine that for most folks in this area, around this idea, or rather the experience of this idea, would be a completely foreign thing. Could we receive that kind of love? So that I love you. I love you just as you are. And I don't want anything from you. Right? I love you just as you are. I don't want anything from you. Okay? Not even your tithe, by the way. I love you just as you are. I don't want anything from you. And I want you to step into the courage of that and turn to your neighbor and say, I love you just as you are. I don't want anything from you.
I love you.
Okay, so we don't miss anybody out. Turn to the other side. I love you just as you are, and I don't want anything from you. I love you just as you are, and I don't want anything from you. So does that give you the willies or what?
Yeah.
Can you feel the shift? I love you just as you are. I want nothing from you. This is an aspect of Christ consciousness. When we talk about Christ consciousness, this is one of the aspects that we are speaking to. So that in this way then, when the carpenter says, no one comes to the Father but through me, what this means is that we must align our thought, align our heart, align our thought vibrations of vulnerability, of openness, to being open to Spirit wholly and completely. To be a revolutionary for love. This was what Christ was. A revolutionary of love. This is how he showed up. Think about it. Even the money changers in the temple, he was mad at the activity, yes. Right? He was mad that they had turned this house of worship into a place of commerce. But he didn't hate the people who were doing it. No one comes to the Father but through me. Aligning our thought, aligning our heart, wholly and completely, to be a revolutionary in love. Now, this is not always so easily accomplished, this state of mind. And acknowledging this, acknowledging this I know, I'd be crying too if I listened to these. Okay. Acknowledging this, we must also remember, actually we need to remember that this state of mind is always within us. And that we must choose then to engage with it. To engage with it to the extent that we can. That this state of mind, large M mind, is always available. It is nearer than breathing. It is closer than hands and feet. So what are the limiting factors then? What are the limiting factors when we're in that place? Knowing that this is available to us. Well, basically it comes down to fear, anger, and resentment. Fear, anger, and resentment. Fear, anger, resentment. The far country. Right? So when we live in the far country, as the prodigal son did, we cannot claim our divine inheritance. We can't receive the fatted calf. We don't get the ring. We don't get the best robe. Fear, anger, resentment. So we are afraid that we're not going to get what we want. Or we're afraid we're going to lose that which we already have. That it's going to be taken from us. And that the anger, the resentment, the fear that we engage in around this activity causes us to suffer, to armor up, and to shut down. Our vulnerability is thrown out the window. And we are no longer open to the sunlight of the Spirit. So the Lord Buddha would call these attachments. Right? That the dukkha, the wanting to cling or to push away. Cling to the things that we want, afraid we're going to lose them, or push them away because we're afraid of them. The push-pull of attachments. So our attachments then are our own crown of thorns within our own mind. Each thorn, an error in thought, causing us to suffer. It is the log within our own eye which we must remove so that we might see clearly. That we must remove in order to align ourselves with the consciousness of love that's already within us. That we, in this alignment, we become a revolutionary of love in our own life, in this present time, that we are living an example of Christ's consciousness, and that we shift not only ourselves, but everyone around us. So repeat after me. I am a revolutionary of love. I am a revolutionary of love. I transform my world with the power of love. I transform my world with the power of love. I am inspired and replenished by the infinite power of Spirit. I am inspired and replenished by the infinite power of Spirit. So this power is already within us. This love is already within us. It's around us. We're breaststroking through it right now. That we're creating waves of love in our wake. Every time we turn our attention that way. This is a revolutionary way to live. Because it takes some major ganas to pull it off. We have to stand in the courage, the conviction, and the truth of knowing that God is all there is. So this is what the way Holmes put it, was that a loaf of bread is just as spiritual as the Lord's Prayer. A blade of grass just as holy as the crucifixion. It is only as we sense this divine immanence in everything that we shall guess the slightest meaning of the cross, which is a symbol of the absolute and complete givingness of life to itself. So Holmes asks the question, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see the symbol of the cross as a symbol for unlimited life? A symbol for unlimited life. That the vertical connects to the infinite. The vertical line connecting to the infinite with the finite. and that the horizontal line of spiritual energy spreading throughout the universe, each line extending to infinity. And he asks a question, wouldn't there be a quite different psychological reaction if we no longer felt we had to demonstrate our love, or prove our love, or provide a lesson of what love can do, but simply we were doing that thing? Then we couldn't help doing the other things. So we talk about in affirmative prayer or spiritual mind treatment, there are steps. The first two are recognizing that God is all there is, and that I am one with it, and it is one with me. And that if we can practice just those two steps fully and completely, that all will be added unto us. Practicing just those two things. And then Holmes says this, Jesus allowing himself to be on the cross to illustrate that the universal energy flows vertically through him, and he becomes a generator of energy to horizontally spread it through the universe. So, if Jesus is the great example rather than the great exception, which is what we teach here, then what's true for him is true for you and true for me as well. Holmes says this thing the mystics have sensed, and the reason that Jesus, in my estimation, allowed himself to be crucified. This is Holmes. Allowed himself to be crucified because I do not think he had to, and I'm sure that God didn't demand that he should be. He said that in 33. And so we need not crucify ourselves either. We need not crucify ourselves for past deeds. There's only room for one on the cross. He's already up there. Right? But we're not going to enhance our life one whit by suffering for suffering's sake. We have to get that idea out of our consciousness in order to receive. That there is no blood debt to pay to the holy lover, the beloved, the anointed. And our example to live fully, completely, lovingly, effectively as centers and generators of love consciousness and singers in training. Let's go within. Just for today, we're going to step down from the cross and see what it feels like. Just for today, we're going to roll away the stone from our old ways of thinking and courageously step into the vulnerability of loving fiercely, courageously, everyone who comes in contact with us today. And through that emphasis, generate enough energy to lift ourselves, to lift those around us today, and to generate enough energy to take into our week. And pay attention. See if things haven't shifted and lifted for good in your own life in a different way this week.
There is only